Okay, so welcome to this workshop, or this webinar, sorry, Understanding and Healing from Shame. It's very lovely to have you all here today, and my name's Beth. In this webinar, please do feel free to put questions in the chat for those of you who are watching it live, and we will take a break halfway through and I will look at your questions then. But I won't be stopping throughout the webinar to be looking at questions. Okay, so today we are looking at understanding and healing from shame. Here we go, just do that. All right. So the aims of this webinar are to increase in our self-understanding of shame and domestic abuse, to understand the abuse is not your fault or your responsibility. And hopefully by understanding shame and realizing it's not your fault, that the abuse is not your fault, you will start to think about how you can let go of it and replace it with self-compassion. So those are the aims of today's webinar. I know we've only got less than 2 hours, and those might feel like very big aims for just 2 hours. So we won't get everything done in this webinar, but hopefully it will be a positive start for you and an introduction into understanding your shame and moving on from it. Okay, please think about self-care whilst watching this webinar. If you are watching this because you have experienced domestic abuse, you may become tearful and sad or angry, and this is normal. You have suffered. So please try and be kind to yourself. If you need to take a break, that's fine. If you need to turn off, that's fine. If you need to go and get some tissues or a cup of tea, or you need to go out and get some fresh air, please do. You are in control of this. Different memories may come up during this webinar, and this may be distressing. So please try and be compassionate to yourself. Afterwards, it's very normal to feel tired and drained, especially if distressing memories have come up. So if you are able to, you may want to take a rest in a safe and peaceful environment. So self-care is really important when we do any webinars or workshops at Women's Trust. Now, the contents of this webinar, just so you're prepared, we're going to be looking at some facts about domestic abuse. We're going to understand the difference between shame and guilt. We're going to understand why survivors of abuse feel shame. We're going to understand shame within an abusive relationship. And we're going to understand the origins of shame, the impacts of shame, and hopefully we're going to increase our understanding of trauma and shame. We're also going to look at the cycle of shame and how we break it, and also understanding how other people shame us and healing from shame at the end. I mean, this whole webinar is really about healing from shame, because my belief is the more we understand it, the more we will heal from it. And right at the end, we're going to be signposting to organisations which can also provide legal and practical support for those of you who need that. Okay, I'm just going to start with some facts about domestic abuse in the UK. So almost 1 in 3 women between the ages of 16 and 59 will experience domestic abuse in her lifetime. That's just in the UK. That statistic is a lot bigger in other countries. And also that's the numbers that we know of. Many women keep their domestic abuse a secret, partly because of shame, or also because they don't realise it's abuse. So these are just the numbers that we know of. Also, we know that 2 women are killed every week by a current or former partner, and that's in England and Wales alone. It's actually 1 every 3 days, so it's slightly more than 2 women a week. In the year ending March 2019, 1.6 million women in the UK experienced domestic abuse. Again, that's only the women that we know about. So many women don't get help and they don't ask for help, and often that is because of shame. I always try and include a few facts about domestic abuse because I think it's really important that we understand what a widespread issue it is, that it can happen to any woman of any background. It obviously can happen to men as well, but just to say at the bottom there, it says 90% of domestic abuse victims are women. So today this webinar is from Women's Trust and we are showing it to women. It's largely women who are victims of domestic abuse. And often they keep it secret and they don't talk about it. So those numbers won't be a true indication of the full scale of domestic abuse in the UK. I think those figures are really shocking, but I also include them because I want you to know you're not alone. Many women I work with are so compassionate to other women who've suffered abuse, but so hard on themselves. So in this webinar, we'll be trying to think about really being kind to yourself, okay? Moving on. Okay, so I'm going to start this workshop, this webinar now. I'm going to look at the difference between shame and guilt. And I think it's really important we understand what shame is before we start it. So when we feel guilt, it's about something we did. I feel guilty quite often in the morning when I shout at my kids because we're late for school. And I always think, oh, I shouldn't shout, you know. And then I try and learn from that and think, okay, tomorrow I'll do better. I'll get up a bit earlier. I'll get things a bit more ready so we're not rushing out of the house. So guilt is something I think a lot of mums feel. It's a normal feeling, and it's about something we've done. It's about our behavior. But when we feel shame, it's about who we are. So it's a very different feeling. So guilt is the belief that one has done something bad, and shame is the belief that one is bad. Shame is also the belief that we are not lovable and that something is wrong with us. So guilt can be healthy and unhealthy. If we beat ourselves up, it can become self-destructive. However, if we learn from our mistakes, it can be beneficial. So everyone feels guilty. A lot of women I work with might feel guilty when I think they shouldn't, and they might beat themselves up really harshly. And that might be about low self-esteem, that they're very, very self-critical and they judge themselves very harshly. So guilt can certainly be unhealthy, but we can learn from our mistakes. And that's part about being a grown-up and taking responsibility, that we can learn from our mistakes, but we can also separate our behavior from who we are. So we can see that we make mistakes, but that doesn't make us bad people. When we have shame, we feel bad about who we are, and this can keep us stuck in negative patterns. And we're going to look at that later. One of the biggest negative patterns I see with people with shame is that they're incredibly self-critical and they beat themselves up, and that keeps us stuck in the shame. So today, what I really want us to think about is being a bit kinder to ourselves, a bit less critical, and how we can break that sort of shame cycle in our head. If we are permanently feeling we're bad, we will shame ourselves for everything and be incredibly self-critical. And if we feel that shame, on some level, we might think, well, we're not really worthwhile. We don't really deserve to be happy or to heal. So shame can also really interfere with our ability to heal because it interferes with our self-worth. So we're going to be looking at that today. Okay. I just put this in a really big writing because I think it's really important. Many women talk about feeling bad about themselves, and they are bad and they're less than. And in all my work, I've worked with hundreds, maybe even thousands of women affected by domestic abuse. And what I see is sadness, not badness. And I think that's a really important distinction. You've suffered. Just because you have suffered, it does not mean you're a bad person. It means you're in pain and you feel sad, but it does not mean you're bad. So that is just something really simple that I hope you can take from today. When you feel you're bad, try and replace the word with sad. When you recognize your sadness, you can start bringing understanding to your experience and hopefully bring compassion to your experience as well. Okay, so we're going to start with the understanding about shame and why does domestic abuse make us feel shame? Now, sometimes we may already feel shame due to childhood abuse, and that's very common. And I work with many women who were abused or neglected in their childhood, and that's made them feel less than and not worthy, and that brings a lot of shame to them. But I also work with women who didn't have that, and regardless of childhood experiences, nearly all women, I think all women that I work with, feel shame after the domestic abuse. We're going to explore why. These are the most common reasons I see that long-term domestic abuse, it chips away at our identity and our self-confidence. It makes us feel crap, basically. We are brainwashed by being given the repeated message that it is our fault. And very often we are told that we're the mad, bad, crazy ones and that something is wrong with us. Also, abuse is violating. We absorb the abuse, and we also try and make sense of the abuser's actions. And this is a really important thing to remember. If it was a stranger who was abusing us, we'd be able to see very clearly or more clearly that it's abuse. If someone came up in the street and hurled abuse at you, you'd think, well, I've never met them before. This person probably has mental health problems. They don't know me. It's their problem. And we'll be able to quite easily separate, or more easily separate from the abuse and see it's not our fault. In the context of a domestic abuse relationship, that changes and we lose our clarity because we're so up close to it. And the abuser is someone that we love, we did love once, or it's someone we trust, or we did once trust. And because of that, and because it's inconsistent, and sometimes they're really nice to us, we try and make sense of the abuse. And how we try and make sense of it is by understanding it. And often the conclusion we come up with is it must be my fault, that their behavior must be something to do with me. So we personalize the abuse and then we believe it's our fault and we're the problem. So today I want us to try and unhook from that and step back from that and see the abuse for what it is, that it is abuse and it's not our problem, okay? I know it sounds really easy for me to say, but that's what I want you all to think about. Okay, so responsibility and shame. So just a little bit more about what I just said. Abusers blame their victims and they take no responsibility for their abuse. They blame the victim and they convince her that the abuse is justified and rational. It is not. Okay, really important to remember. Abusers lie and they gaslight. Okay, but if you're told something repeatedly, you sort of get brainwashed and you start to believe that you are responsible for the abuser's behavior and therefore responsible for the abuse. You are not. And by the way, when I use the word victim, I understand that some people really don't like the word victim, and I really appreciate that. I'm just using it for the sake of clarity in this. So I'll be using the word abuser and perpetrator and the word victim. But if you don't like those words, that's absolutely fine. And you can replace them for whatever you want to. So the mistaken sense of responsibility can make the woman believe that if they change themselves, they will stop the abuse. Or they may feel responsible for the abuser. And this is very common too. So I work with a lot of women who feel if they can heal their partner or love their partner enough, that he or she will stop being abusive. And if they cannot do this, they may see themselves as a failure. So the abusive relationship sets the victim up to feel like a failure. They're a failure because they can't stop the abuse. And they're a failure because they feel they can't heal their partner to make them stop the abuse. I want to say this really clearly. You are not a failure. It is not your fault and it is not your responsibility. The perpetrator is the one who is responsible for their actions and their abuse. And we will be looking at this more in this webinar. What I would say is even after the relationship ends, the victim may still have a large responsibility for others. That's something I see a lot in women I work with at Women's Trust, that they feel really responsible for other people's pain or discomfort, and they often want to rescue other people. So if you relate to that, that's completely normal. But in this webinar, we're going to be really just focusing on us. Okay, so many women I work with spend their whole lives worrying about or feeling responsible for other people. So we're just going to try and bring it back to you, thinking about you and your experiences. Okay, now this is the wheel of power and control, and I often show this in workshops and webinars, so you might have seen it before. If when I read through this, I'll be just reading out the words, but this will bring up memories for you that you relate to, so please be compassionate to yourselves. We're going to be looking at this tool just to understand why survivors feel shame. Okay. Oh, sorry, just go back to there. So, at the heart of this wheel is power and control. The perpetrator uses intimidation to make the victim feel afraid. So we'll go to the top right-hand piece of this chart first. So using intimidation, making the victim feel afraid by using looks, actions, gestures, smashing things, destroying her property, maybe abusing her pets or displaying weapons. And then using emotional abuse, putting her down, making her feel bad about herself, calling her names, making her think she's crazy, playing mind games, humiliating her, making her feel guilty. Using isolation, controlling what she does, who she sees and talks to, what she reads, where she goes, limiting her outside involvement, and using jealousy to justify actions. Minimizing, denying, and blaming, making light of the abuse and not taking her concerns seriously, saying the abuse didn't happen, shifting the responsibility for the abusive behavior and saying she caused it. And that's very, very common. Using the children, making the victim feel bad about her mothering and feel guilty about the children, maybe using the children to relay messages, using visitation to harass mum or threatening to take the children away. Using male privilege, obviously, and I should have said this right at the start, women can be perpetrators too, absolutely. It usually at Women's Trust, typically the perpetrators are male, but obviously they can be female as well. But in this section, there's a bit on using male privilege, treating the woman like a servant, making all the big decisions, acting like the king of the castle, and being the one to define men and women's roles. Also using economic abuse, preventing her from getting or keeping a job, making her ask for money, giving her an allowance or taking her money, not letting her know about or have access to the family income. And then the last piece of this is using coercion and threats, making or carrying out threats to do something to hurt the woman, threatening to leave her, threatening to commit suicide, report her to social services, making her drop the charges, or making her do illegal things. On the outside of this wheel of power and control, it says physical violence and sexual violence. Obviously, those are huge subjects and they can cover both subtle physical and sexual abuse to very extreme sexual and physical violence. So when I go through that, some of you might relate to every bit of that wheel. It's all about power and control, and that's what the perpetrator wants, and that's what's at the heart of that wheel. What I think when I look at it is, how could anyone live with that and not start feeling ashamed about themselves? Because it's a type of brainwashing, and we'll be looking at this. If you are being abused repeatedly and long term, which is what domestic abuse is, you will start losing yourself and you'll start forgetting who you are and you'll start believing what you're told. Now, these are the sorts of things that come up very, very frequently in my work. These are the things that I hear a lot, that women's intelligence, their brain, their cognitive abilities are attacked. So very often women are called stupid, thick, uneducated, incapable of thinking clearly, messed up in their head, that sort of language. Also, your sanity, your mental health is attacked. Very often you'll be called crazy, mad, messed up. Also, you'll be told that you have issues and you're messed up because of the issues you went through in your childhood. So often it's very common that if you trust the perpetrator and tell them things about you or things that have happened to you in the past, they will then use that against you and say you're messed up because of it. Also, often you'll be called the perpetrator and accused of being an abuser as well. Then your sexuality is abused. You might be called a slag, a slut, a whore, or the reverse of that. You might be told you're cold, you're uptight, you're frigid, you're not normal sexually. And then there's your femininity or your physical appearance. You might be made to feel very ugly, unattractive, sexually unattractive. It's very normal that women I work with, their bodies are criticized. Either they're told they're too fat, they're too thin, bits of their body too large or too small. You might be compared to other women as well. That's very normal. And then you might be told endlessly that you're useless, you're incompetent, you're incapable. So that would have a huge impact on your confidence. And then your social skills. You might be told that you're really embarrassing when you're out, that no one likes you, that you've got nothing interesting to say, that people are only using you, that men are only talking to you because they want to have sex with you. So women often end up self-isolating as well. You might also, your mothering skills might also be criticized as well, that you're too messed up to be a good mom, you're a bad cook, you can't take care of the house, you're a bad mom, you're incompetent. So you can see if you're hearing this over and over and over again, or even if you're not hearing it, but you're just getting this message by the way you're being treated, you will start to really doubt yourself. And then there's gaslighting, where the perpetrator denies they deny your reality and deny your truth. So that could be very extreme things. So they might hide your phone or hide your property and make you feel like you're going mad because you can't find things. Or more typically, it might be they deny your reality. So they will deny the abuse. They will deny what they said. They will minimize it and say you're making a fuss. This leads to huge self-doubt. It leads to women questioning themselves. Is it my fault? Do I deserve this? And this leads to a great deal of shame. I put all those things in because sometimes I do a chart where women can come and write up the sorts of things they've been told or the way they've been treated. And this is very, very commonly what I see, all the sorts of words that are on this page. If you're being told that repeatedly and you're isolated from other support, you will start absorbing those messages and you will start believing them. And you will start feeling something is wrong with you and you are less than. What I want to say really clearly is nothing is wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. You've suffered. You might have suffered in your life. You might have sadness, but not badness. Okay, so remember that thing right at the beginning: sad, not bad. And that also perpetrators, they want to control you, and they often find the thing about you that's most special, that's most loved, and they try and destroy it. So it's not you, it's them. And all the things they call you, all the ways they treat you, they only reveal the type of person that the perpetrator is. If you talk to someone like that, it says everything about the sort of person you are. It says nothing about the person you're talking to. Okay? Really important to remember as well, perpetrators lie. Okay? So, moving on. So we understand that now why women feel shame because of domestic abuse. And then victims often feel ashamed of telling others about the abuse. This is because they've been made to believe it's their fault. Or also people say things like, well, if it's that bad, why don't you leave? Which is a really common question. And this is a very shaming question to ask. We'll be looking at why women stay a bit later. It's so important we understand that. So women often will end up minimizing or denying the abuse and not telling anyone. Also, if it's very subtle psychological abuse, which often it is, they might not even realize it's happening because they're so trapped in it, they don't see it clearly. So shame stops women from speaking out. It's the reason why people who have been abused may not feel anger or ask for help, The shame has triggered the sense in the other person that they are wrong at their core and their experience is not valid. And therefore you have no right to be angry. You have no right to speak out. You have no right to be protected, and you have no right to ask for help. So shame is like a prison and it silences us. Okay, now I can see that some people are asking questions in the chat. And for those of you who came late, we'll be stopping for a break halfway through, and then I will look at the questions and answer some of them. Okay, so moving on. Shame is all about control. So we looked at the wheel of power and control, and everything, all abuse is about control. But also, it's also about shaming you, because when you feel shamed, you are controlled as well. So you cannot be angry or stand up for your human rights when you've been told you have no rights and your feelings and thoughts are invalidated. Therefore, shame stops us connecting with ourselves, and it makes us distrust our responses, and we are shamed into silence. When abusers shame their victims, it is a very powerful form of control. It stops the victim speaking out, seeking help, and expressing herself. If we carry on living in shame after the relationship, we are still being controlled. So how can we break free from the shame? Now, I know there's no quick fix to this. There's no quick answers, but we need to develop these two tools if we're going to heal from trauma and abuse. So in all my work, these are the two most important things I want women to start connecting with. So the first one is self-understanding. And then alongside that, it's really important we have self-compassion. The women I work with are typically very smart and very able to look at what's happened to them and understand it. But they might struggle with this self-compassion. They're typically very, very hard on themselves. The key to healing from shame has to be both of these together, okay? So we need to understand our shame with self-compassion. That means understanding our shame without judgment. It is very important we do not shame ourselves for feeling shame. So your shame is part of your experience. It's a normal response to abuse. Please don't feel ashamed about your shame. Please try and look at your shame with compassion and understanding. So we need to replace shame with self-compassion. And this is how we break from the cycle of shame within ourselves. So that little bit at the beginning where I just had that page saying sadness, not sad, not bad, that's a really good start. When you're beating yourself up because of where you're at now and the abuse you've gone through, remember that you have suffered, okay? And because you've suffered, it does not mean you're a bad person. It means you have suffered. And when people have suffered, they need compassion. So we can keep it really, really simple. The other thing is that these two things, self-understanding and self-compassion, they're so important for healing because it's how we create safety within ourselves. Now, I don't know the people watching this, some of you may still be in an abusive relationship, some may not be in an abusive relationship. But abuse keeps us tense the whole time. We cannot relax when we're living with abuse because we're in fear. We're in fear the whole time. Now, often, even after we've left the relationship, we still feel that fear for a very long time afterwards because we've become so used to living in fear that we just feel tense the whole time and hypervigilant. And that's about trauma. And we'll be looking at trauma a bit further on in this webinar. But to heal, we really need to try and create internal safety. And that means creating a gentle, soft place within ourselves, rather than a harsh, self-critical place. So many women I work with have internalized the abuser's voice, and they are permanently beating themselves up and putting themselves down. And that keeps us in an internal, very anxious state. If you were working with someone if you met someone who's very upset and very sad, you wouldn't beat them up. You wouldn't say to them, well, it's your fault. And you wouldn't compare them to other people. And you wouldn't say to them, well, you should be over this by now and you should be feeling better by now. I don't think anyone watching this would do that. If you were with someone who's very upset, you'd probably be really kind to them, give them a hug and listen to them and be really compassionate. So I guess I'm asking you all to try and show that self-compassion to yourselves, okay? The compassion you show to other people, try and show to yourselves. If you do that, you then create more safe internal psychological safety, and that allows you to relax more. And when we relax, we're more able to heal. Okay. Now, if that's a bit complicated, don't worry about that. Just stick with the self-compassion bit, just being kind to yourself. When we're kind to ourselves, we are saying, I matter and I am important. And that in itself is really powerful because you're breaking the cycle of abuse, which is saying you're worthless and you don't matter. So self-compassion is the absolute key to healing, and alongside self-understanding. The more we understand trauma, the more we understand domestic abuse and its impacts on us, the more we realize that our responses are normal, and then we're more likely to be able to be kind to ourselves. So these are the two things that I'm always looking for in my work. And you might not agree, and that's fine, but I guess I'd invite you just to think about these things in this webinar. Okay. Also going to be looking here at understanding the origins of shame. Now, this is a huge, huge subject. And so we're going to be very briefly touching on shaming messages that we might have had in our childhood. I've included this because although this webinar is about adult domestic abuse, many women I work with also experienced shaming messages in their childhood. And it can be good to bring some consciousness to those messages and look at them. So shame can be complex, and we can internalize shaming messages unconsciously in our childhood. This can then make us feel we deserve the abuse we experience in our adult relationships. And it can also make it harder for us to protect ourselves and make boundaries. So it can be helpful to understand if you did have shaming messages in your childhood. If you did, please be compassionate to yourself. These are the sorts of families where you might get some shaming messages. The neglecting family. This is the family where you feel like a non-person. Women often describe feeling invisible in this sort of family where they weren't seen, they weren't validated. You do not have the right to exist or express yourself or be seen or be validated. And the message in the neglecting family is you are not valued and something is wrong with us. This neglect can then leave us vulnerable to the perpetrators when they love bomb us and give us very focused attention. So yeah, perpetrators, we know when we meet them, they can often give us very intense, very powerful love bombing and attention and make us feel really special. And if you've been very neglected all your life, that might be the very thing you crave, to feel special and seen. So understandably, you might be more vulnerable to that. There's a lot more you could say about this. There's only a couple of lines here, but I'll move on. Then there's the enmeshed family. This is the family where there's no boundaries, where it's not okay to be an individual or express difference or the self as separate. For example, when mum is happy, the child is happy. But when mum is depressed, the child is sad also. So that can be the sorts of family where you're not allowed to even feel your own feelings. You have to feel what other people are feeling. And you really can't individuate or be separate. So codependent patterns can be set up in this, where the child only sees themselves as value in relationship to others, and possibly becomes a sort of caring type person, or perhaps a people pleaser, where they feel they're only worthwhile if they're looking after or caring for other people. The shaming message from this type of family could be that it's selfish or wrong to value and care for yourself. And many women I work with feel a lot of guilt about prioritizing self-care. And that's something that we can work with and start right now. I believe that it's our responsibility to try and value ourselves and care for ourselves, because no one else is going to do it for us. So, and yeah, and whilst it's beautiful qualities to care for other people, it doesn't mean that caring for other people means you have to neglect yourself. So, we can still care for other people, but also just put ourselves in the picture as well. I hear this a lot from women I work with. They say things like, I'm at the back of the queue, everyone else's needs come first and mine come up the end. So what I want to say is your needs are as important as anyone else's. So please try and hold on to that. The abusive family, this is where a child might experience sexual abuse or physical abuse, which is obviously has a huge impact, and leaves the child feeling damaged and that something must be wrong with her. That sense of something wrong is often an unconscious feeling. The child might not consciously feel that, but on an unconscious level, they'll think, well, if my parents, who I trust and love, are treating me like this, then something must be wrong with me. This sense of worthlessness and feeling less than others is often carried into adult life. And the victim does not know how to value or protect self. Last of all, we have the controlling family, where the child feels controlled and dominated. It is impossible to express self or live according to own desires. And the child is not allowed to truly be themselves and has to conform to other people's needs or wants or be perfect, for example, to feel acceptable. Now, if any of those family types, and you might relate to all of them or none of them or some of them, but if you do relate to any of them, please take some time to show some compassion to the younger you that suffered, and recognize that you might have had some shaming messages in your childhood, as well as the shaming messages you got from your abusive adult relationships. All of these types of abuse I've just gone through are a denial of freedom to truly be and express oneself. So if that is you, please be kind to yourself. And many women, when they come to Women's Trust, feel they've lost themselves. And some women say they didn't really feel they ever knew themselves. And that can be a scary place to be. But I also think it can be a sort of another way to think of it is it could be an adventure, that now you can actually think about getting to know yourself, and you could be free of these shaming messages and actually start getting to know you for you and being true to yourself. And I know it's easier said than done, but we'll move on and think about how we can do that. One more thing I want to touch on here is cultural shame. Now, this is a huge, complex subject, and it's going to mean different things to each person watching this webinar. And sadly, we don't have the time to properly address this. But just to say that in some cultures, there can be a big emphasis on public appearances and being seen to be honourable within the community. This can be both religious and cultural communities. And causing dishonour in the community can be hugely shameful to the individual and their family. So honour-based violence is also a form of domestic abuse, and this is when abuse is justified by being done in the name of honour. So those who do not abide by the rules are then punished for bringing shame on the family. Now, this can happen to children, teenagers, and adults. So honour-based violence can happen at any age. It could be for having a boyfriend or a girlfriend. It could be for being gay, having sex or pregnancy outside marriage. It could be seeking a divorce, having interfaith relationships, or wearing clothes or makeup that's seen as inappropriate, or mixing with people that are seen as inappropriate. So that can add another layer to shame. So as we're seeing, shame can be very multi-layered. It can start in our childhood, it can be cultural shame, and then obviously there's the abuse, there's the shame from domestic abuse. So it can be a very complex, multi-layered subject. Okay, so I'm just looking at the time. We're going to take a break in about 10 minutes. So if you want to put any questions on the chat, please do. The impacts of shame. People who carry a lot of shame due to abusive relationships, either from childhood or adulthood, can be very hard and critical on themselves. We've talked about this before, that you might internalize the abusive and controlling voices you've heard. And that can leave us with some very tough unconscious rules to live by. So you might feel you always have to be in control, that you always have to be perfect, that you can't truly express yourself. You always have to maybe agree with others or stay quiet or not make a fuss. It could be you don't trust anyone with how you really feel, because something might be you feel something is wrong with you and you're ashamed about that, or because of your experiences of abuse, you just don't trust humanity, understandably. So another impact of shame can be incredible loneliness and isolation. It can be don't make mistakes. Typically, people with a lot of shame are very, very hard on themselves if they feel they've made a mistake. And also because of shame, there can be a lot of self-doubt, a real lack of confidence. So there can be a real loss of self-empowerment. And the message is don't trust yourself. So don't trust anyone else, but also don't trust yourself. So when there's a lot of shame, it can be really just a destabilizing place to be and a very lonely place to be. So if you recognize any of those impacts, please have some compassion for yourself, because it's like living in a prison where there's lots of rules that you have to live by to be acceptable. We just do this part now. So the impacts of shame will also continue into this. Unconditional love is something we all crave and all need, and it's when we are loved for who we are, no matter what we do. That is ideally, it doesn't often happen, the love that your parents should have for you, where they love you for who you are. They might not approve of certain aspects of your behavior, and they might have to teach you about behavior and boundaries, but you have a sense that you're loved for who you are. Conditional love is what many people actually experience, and it's when we are loved for doing what other people want us to do. And each of us has these conditions of worth. So I'd like you just to think about the following. If I am to be loved, I have to, or I must be this. Now, I'll explain a bit more in the next page, but think about the messages that come from the people who've controlled you or abused you. And how do they make you feel you had to behave to deserve love? Because that is conditional love. And that sets up a whole load of rules which we feel we have to live by. So have a little think about that, and then I'll show you the next page. Okay, so these are the answers that I typically hear when I do this exercise with women, that if I am to be loved or if I am to be valued, I must do the following. I must take care of others. I must work hard, not make a noise, be invisible, never ask for things, never cry, never get angry, never complain, please others, sacrifice myself for others, be good, behave, be silent, be small, be the best, but don't be too successful, do as I'm told, be clever, don't be proud of myself, be strong, keep secrets, don't ask for help, don't be vulnerable, don't be loud, don't speak out, don't disagree, don't argue, don't challenge, don't defend yourself, don't make boundaries. So that'd be don't say no, be perfect, don't make mistakes, put others first, be thinner or be curvier, be pretty or be prettier, get top grades at school, be subservient. Another one I hear is often I have to give money, I have to give away my money. I had to sacrifice that. Now, some of you might have different ones. These are the ones that typically come up. And when I look at that, I feel really sad, because to me, it's like a prison that stops you really being who you are and really being expressing yourself. And it also makes us feel that just us being us is not worth loving, that we're only worth loving if we do all these, if we meet all these impossible standards of other people. So I put at the bottom of that, how do you feel reading that list? I feel really sad reading it, because I think, as I said, it's a way of controlling people. You might look at that and feel sad because you might relate to it or some of it. You might feel angry or trapped or controlled. And why I've included that, because when we break free of shame, or try and break free of shame, it's really important that we think about unconditional love. And unconditional love is when we love ourselves for who we are. If we love ourselves just for being us, not for what we're doing for other people. Now, when I talk about that, people often find that really hard to think about, that they could love themselves. And that's a big, big question. And it might not be something you feel you're able to do at this point. And that's absolutely fine. And if you feel like that, I recognize that and have compassion. But that's sort of, when we have conditional love, it's saying we're only worthwhile if we're pleasing other people. And unconditional love is saying, actually, I'm all right now, even if I'm not pleasing anyone else. And that can be a real challenge. But when I'm talking about self-compassion, it's about showing yourself unconditional acceptance as you are right now. Now, I know for some of you that might feel like an impossible place to arrive at, but I do believe it's possible if we just start with very baby steps, very small steps of understanding our abuse, understanding the impacts, and just trying to show ourselves a little bit more kindness. Okay, so we're going to take a break now. Okay, so welcome back to the webinar. I've got some really excellent questions here. One of the first ones I got is, someone said, please, can you explain gaslighting? So gaslighting, and I'm sorry I didn't explain that properly before. Gaslighting is when the perpetrator makes you doubt your own reality, okay? And they can make you believe that you're going mad. And they can do this by just outright lying, by denying they said things, or denying they've done things. And then you have a different reality where you're thinking, well, you did say this and you did do that, but they deny it so emphatically that you start doubting yourself and you start doubting your reality. And you think that maybe you made it up, or you're exaggerating, or you imagined it and it's your fault. At its most extreme, it can make a woman feel like she's going mad. They can do this by lying and minimizing and denying, basically, is how they do it. It can be emotional gaslighting, where they'll deny, for example, an act of abuse happened. They'll deny they said something to you. It can also be done with physical things. I think I said this earlier in the webinar, where it might be that I've worked with women where their mobile phone might get stolen from them or moved around. And then they think they're going mad because they keep losing it and they can't find it. And actually it's the perpetrator who's hiding their property. So it can be done with physical things, but more commonly it's very subtle and it's done psychologically. I hope that explains it. If you are interested, if you just write "what is gaslighting" into Google, there are some really good explanations, and actually Wikipedia do a good explanation of gaslighting as well, if you want to read more about it. Someone else put a really good question in. Is powerlessness to do anything about the domestic abusive relationship and the abuser the same as shame? It's a really good question. It's sort of complex. What I would say is powerlessness is how most women feel in domestic abuse, because the whole essence of the abuse is to make you feel like that. the perpetrator wants to feel they have all the power and control in the relationship. And that's why that wheel of power and control shows how they do that, how they break you down and then get all the power and control. But what is known is that if you feel powerless in your life, you're far more likely to have anxiety. You're far more likely to have depression. And then when you have those sorts of mental health issues like anxiety and depression, you're far more likely to feel shame. You feel shame because you feel helpless, you feel disempowered, you feel embarrassed because you feel pathetic or weak. And they also tell you you're those things as well. So when you feel powerless, you often feel shame as well. Absolutely. And there's another really good question which someone put. So at the in the last part of the webinar, I said, how do you feel when I go through that list? The list we talked about where you have to please other people to be loved. And someone said, is it normal to feel numb? And absolutely, numbness is the most normal response, I'd say, to trauma. It's what happens when you're traumatized. You disconnect from your feelings. And also when you're in an abusive relationship, you have to disconnect from your feelings because your feelings can actually make things worse. If you express your anger or your pain, the perpetrator might punish you. So the abuse might get worse. So women learn to disconnect from their feelings and sort of numb themselves from their feelings. And that's a way of sort of numbing just so you can endure the abuse. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's pretty much what happens. Just reading down a bit more there. Yes, I'm just seeing if there's any more questions. So I think what we'll do now is we'll carry on with the webinar. And then if you want to put any more questions in the chat, please do. And at the end, I will look at them again. Okay. So moving on. Okay, so we're going to now look at the impacts of shame a bit more, which hopefully might answer some of the questions that were just coming in. So people with a strong sense of shame are more likely to have very low self-esteem. They see themselves as flawed. They might constantly compare self to others and self-evaluate in a very judgmental way and have a strong internal critic. They also might feel, because they have low self-worth, they might really struggle with boundaries and saying no. This is because they feel they have no worth, they have no self that's worth protecting. So when people talk to me about boundaries, people often say, how can I set boundaries? Where it starts is valuing yourself, because when you value yourself, you feel you're worth protecting, and then it's much easier to make boundaries. If you don't value yourself, you don't feel you have a self that's worth taking care of. So when there's shame, there's often real issues around boundaries. People with shame find it very, very hard to hear or accept positive feedback. They tend, as I say, they throw it into the black hole. I see that a lot in my group work, that women will hear really loving and positive and true things back from other people in groups, but they will throw it in the black hole and think it's not really about them. It's also very normal to have depression and anxiety disorders. And it's also very normal to have perfectionist traits. If you make a mistake, you'd see this as a failure and really beat yourself up. And really, it can really break you down if you feel you made a mistake, or you've treated someone a bit less well than you should have done, or that you haven't done well at work. You'll really, really beat yourself up about this. There's something called the tyranny of the shoulds. And people who are perfectionists often have a long list of shoulds. I should be doing this, I should be doing that, I should be better by now, I should have got further along, I should be earning more money. And that can be a really tyrannical sort of place to be internally. Also, it's very normal to have secret addiction issues. Sadly, many women are not offered the support and help they need, and they're very isolated due to domestic abuse. And so they might self-medicate their depression or their anxiety with drugs or alcohol, and then that can become part of the shaming cycle. And we'll look at that a bit more later on in this webinar. It's also normal to have suicidal feelings. which you can then feel ashamed about. Especially if you're a mum, you might feel like you're a terrible mum because you feel suicidal and desperate. Of course, you're not, but you're suffering. And so you remember that very thing said at the beginning, which is sad, not bad. Also, it's very normal to feel separate from the human race. A lot of women with shame talk about themselves as if they're other, they don't fit in, and there can be a real sense of paranoia that comes with this, and a real loneliness as well, that you don't fit into the world. Okay, so more impacts of shame, lack of self-identity, because you feel yourself is not worth knowing or getting to know, there can be a real disconnection from self. And the perpetrator wants that to happen as well, because then they can control you more. Find yourself isolated or doing people-pleasing behavior. I'm only worthwhile if I'm caring for others. Lose sense of self within relationships. If you haven't got a strong sense of identity, or if you feel very ashamed about who you are, it can feel more comfortable to lose yourself in your relationships and engulf yourself in others' needs, because then you can sort of hide away from yourself and your shame within the relationship. People with shame find it very hard to ask for help. They think they don't deserve it often, or they're putting other people out if they ask for help. They might find themselves in relationships, and this could be all relationships, not just romantic, but it could be work relationships, friendships, with people who encourage low self-worth. This is also why women are particularly vulnerable after leaving an abusive relationship. If you leave an abusive relationship and you have a lot of shame, and then someone comes along and love bombs you, it'd be very tempting and easy just to sort of lose yourself in another relationship that can open you up to more abuse as well. And that's why it's so important, if it's possible, to try and really learn from the relationship and really understand what happened, to try and break that cycle so it doesn't happen again. Women with shame often have a lot of self-loathing, and this can lead to a lot of self-sabotaging behavior or self-harm. And also they might have real issues with intimacy and trust. So they might feel if someone really knew me, they'd leave me. They wouldn't hang around if they really got to know me. And that's, women often talk about themselves like they're damaged goods. I'm damaged goods, I'm not good enough. Again, it's so important that we separate the abuse from us. And just because we've been abused, it doesn't mean something is wrong with us. It doesn't mean that we're not worth loving. It doesn't mean it's our fault. It's really important we separate and we unhook from the abuse. And yeah. Okay, the other thing I wanted to talk about was post-separation shame. It's often when women are in the relationship, they're in that place of numbness where they're surviving and enduring and just surviving and getting through the day, maybe putting a mask on and minimizing the abuse and pretending to the rest of the world it's not happening. So women are often in that survival mode. So it's often after the relationship that we might get more in touch with our feelings and we might feel more shame. The shame does not just go when we are no longer in the relationship. In fact, that is often when we feel it most. And this is also, we've talked about the shaming messages that you get from the perpetrator, but also it's really important to remember the shaming messages we get from society and also our family and friends. The most common question is, if it was that bad, why did you stay? Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you get help? If people ask this, they might not be meaning to be shaming. They might genuinely mean it, but it shows a real lack of understanding about domestic abuse and trauma bonding and codependency. The other thing that can be shaming is other people might not believe it. They might not believe you. This is also because perpetrators are so often nice and charming in public, and people think they're really lovely and they're really good at doing that. And you come across, possibly because you've been abused for so long, you might come across like the more unstable one, and they seem like the stable, calm one, and you seem like the one with issues. And that can be part of the shame. The other thing is perpetrators often will turn people against you and they will isolate you. So that reinforces the sense that something's wrong with you as well. So it can be that also people don't always believe us, and this can get reinforced in family courts and through the criminal justice system, criminal courts. where the perpetrator so often gets away with it. And this leaves the victim with the injustice and also the sense that you're not believed. And this can be further another shaming thing. You've gone through the criminal justice system, or you've gone through the court system in some way, or a divorce, and you're still not believed. And that again can make us feel very isolated in that we are the crazy one and that other people believe that as well. So society and the messages from society and the media can also shame us as well. It's really important that we recognize this when this happens and try and unhook from it and don't take the shaming messages on. Okay, so I'm now just going to look a bit more at understanding trauma, because I think if we're to understand shame, we have to understand trauma a little bit as well. I always put a bit about trauma in all the webinars because it's so important. If you've been through abuse and that wheel of power and control we saw at the beginning, it's very normal to have these responses. So flashbacks, very typically, maybe to one specific occurrence that was particularly frightening. Hypervigilance, that's the sense of being on edge or hyper alert the whole time. Shock, panic attacks, anxiety, depression, anger, guilt, shame, as we're talking about today, self-disgust, loss of identity, and numbness, as someone brought up, that sense of numbness. Suicidal thoughts, self-blame, self-doubt, lose trust and faith in humanity, think something's wrong with me, confusion, lack of memory, headaches, obsessive thoughts, compulsions, nightmares, sleep paralysis, insomnia, night sweats, feel sick, change in appetite, no motivation, lack of concentration. We might isolate or feel isolated. We might feel very lonely. We might avoid people and relationships and sex because we don't trust anyone anymore. So there's often a lot of loneliness and isolation after abuse. We might self-harm, and we might self-medicate with drugs, alcohol, and food. Now, those are just some of the responses to abuse, and people might have different ones, you might have other ones, you might not have all of them, or you might have all of them, but these are very common. These are typically the sorts of things that I see. And if you have some or all of these symptoms, it's very likely you could have post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a normal response to the frightening and abusive behavior that you've experienced. So many women already feel a lot of shame about domestic abuse they've gone through. And now many women also feel ashamed of having these symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. There still is stigma about mental health, about having depression and anxiety. And there can be a real stigma, or women can feel a sense of stigma about having these symptoms. You might feel something is wrong with you and you're not normal. And that can also be a really shaming place to be. I work with many women who talk about things like they can't remember things. At work, they forget things, and then they feel really embarrassed and ashamed about that, that they've forgotten how they can't read. They find it really hard to read and absorb information, and that makes them feel really embarrassed and ashamed. Or that they're always late, or they're always chaotic because they find it really hard to get out of bed in the morning because they've got depression, and then that makes them feel ashamed. And then they isolate more and more. And then when they do go out, they feel very awkward and uncomfortable socially. So many women, like I said, they've got post-traumatic stress disorder, and then these symptoms can become another source of shame. So what I want to say here is it's really important to try and show understanding and compassion to yourself if you have these symptoms. Please don't judge yourself. These are a completely normal and expected and a very expected response to frightening and abusive behavior. So if you have these symptoms, they are normal. They are nothing to be ashamed of. Other people might not understand them because they haven't gone through what you've gone through, but that's not your problem. So we have compassion for ourselves. We recognize that post-traumatic stress disorder is a very difficult and painful condition to live with. It means you have suffered a great deal. So please don't shame yourself for your suffering. And many women, if you've experienced childhood abuse, you might also have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, but with more complexities and more layers to it, and maybe more intense symptoms. Now, you would not judge or shame another woman who'd experienced domestic abuse. So it's really important not to judge or shame yourself. Women I work with are so kind to other women when they've got these symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and really understanding, but so hard on themselves. So please, please Be kind to yourself. If you have any of these symptoms of trauma, remember you have trauma, and trauma is a normal response to frightening and abusive behavior. Okay, just something very important, very quickly I'll run through. This isn't a webinar on trauma, but as I said, it's so important to understand trauma if we're going to understand shame. And the trauma from domestic abuse is very, very severe, because trauma is most severe in its impacts when it is human caused rather than a natural disaster. When it's deliberate, so it's human caused and deliberate. It's not a random stranger in the street who's attacking you. It's someone you love and trust. And that's what makes it so traumatic, because you lose your faith in human nature. It makes you really, and you lose your faith in yourself as well. And that's why it's so traumatic and so impactful. Trauma is also most severe when it's repeated, which is in the case with domestic abuse, when it's long-term. And in domestic abuse, that's always the case. We're not talking about an isolated incident. We're talking about repeated abuse that happens over weeks, months, years, sometimes decades. Trauma is most severe when it's done by someone you are in a relationship with, someone you love and trust. And just to add, this is when you get more complex trauma if you've experienced past traumas in your childhood. So I always include that in webinars and workshops, because it's so important to understand why the trauma of domestic abuse is so severe. If we understand trauma and that our responses are normal and to be expected, it can help us to let go of the shame. So please remember this. It's normal. Trauma lasts for a long time. It doesn't just go because we're out of the relationship. It often hits us most hard when we leave the relationship or when we escape from it. It takes a long time to heal from. So please be very, very patient with yourself, and don't compare yourself to others. Don't judge yourself, but just be really, really kind to yourself if you can. Okay, so letting go of shame. We talked a little bit about that today, and we'll just do a bit more. So it is normal and understandable to feel shame after domestic abuse, but this will just keep you feeling like something is wrong with you. So these are the really important things to remember. Nothing is wrong with you. You did not abuse anyone. The abuse you experienced was not your fault. Now, I'm thinking as I read this out, some women will say things like, well, I did become abusive. And what I'd say to that is, if you are abused repeatedly, it's very normal that at some point you're going to react to that and your behavior might become abusive too, okay? Now, obviously, no one here we never advocate violence or abuse, and you might feel guilty about that and you can learn from that, but you might have been driven into that abusive behavior because of the way you were treated. So again, don't beat yourself up about that, but bring understanding to it, okay? The abuse you experienced was not your fault. The abuser is an adult who knows the difference between right and wrong. They're an adult, they're not a child, and they chose to abuse you. And this is why they do it in secret, because they know it's wrong. And this is why they're so often charming in public, because it's very important to abusers that they're perceived as right, and they get validation that they're good, upstanding people. And they know the difference between right and wrong because they choose to do their abuse behind closed doors. And that's why it's called domestic abuse, because it's in the home. The abuser wanted to control you, and they wanted to make you scared and dependent on them. And they wanted you to feel ashamed, because if you feel ashamed, they've got more power over you. So that's how it works. They want you to feel ashamed. However, in this workshop, in this webinar, we're thinking about how we can give the abuser the shame back. The abuser should carry the shame of their actions because they have done something cruel and abusive. You do not have to carry that shame anymore. You can let it go. And we can replace shame with self-compassion and self-understanding. And if we do that, we start to heal and we gain our sense of self and our sense of self-respect. And also with that, we start getting our power back as well. Because as someone mentioned in the question, shame is very disempowering. But when we start giving ourselves compassion, we're making a choice. We're making a choice that we don't have to treat ourselves in the same way the perpetrator treated us, and that we can be kind to ourselves. And that's a really empowering choice to make, that I'm going to choose to value myself. I'm going to choose to take care of myself. And that's very, very empowering. Okay, so many women feel shame because they did not leave the perpetrator. It's therefore important to understand trauma bonding and why it makes it so hard to leave an abusive relationship. When we take time to understand our behavior, we can learn self-compassion and not judge ourselves. So just a very quick bit on trauma bonding, because women often feel very ashamed about staying in a relationship. But trauma bonding creates dependency on the very person who is abusing us. Trauma bonding is a strong psychological connection that develops between the victim and the abuser. The abuser isolates the victim and behaves inconsistently. They can be frightening and cruel, but then they can be kind and affectionate, or stop the abuse for a period of time. And the victim then feels gratitude and love for the abuser and relief that the abuse has stopped. The abuser may also love bomb us, or they might ignore us, and that makes the victim grateful for any attention they get. The rescuer and the abuser are the very same person, which means the bond becomes deeper than other relationships as the victim depends on the abuser to survive. And the victim also clings on to hope that the abuser will be the good person they met at the start. I've just put in the Jekyll and Hyde split. So Jekyll and Hyde is a famous split personality in literature, who had one side of him that was a murderous monster, and the other side that was a charming, caring doctor. And people often talk about this split in their perpetrators, that they were so lovely when they met them, and they can still be so lovely, and then they can turn into a monster as well. And that gives us a hope that they're going to become that good person that we fell in love with at the start. So the abuser becomes both the poison and the cure. And that was what one woman I worked with said that, and she gave me permission to use that because I think it's such a brilliant way of describing trauma bonding, that the very person who's poisoning you and abusing you also becomes the person you turn to help to fix it as well. So they have this huge power over us. And that's one of the reasons why women stay, is trauma bonding, as well as all the practical reasons, housing, children, financial reasons. There's so many reasons why women stay. And it's so important that society tries to understand that, so we don't shame women for staying with a perpetrator. Okay, one more thing I want us to understand before we finish is the cycle of shame. So shame can lead to low self-esteem and blurred boundaries. It can lead to a sense of worthlessness, and it means we're more likely to put up with abusive behavior, as this is in keeping with our low self-worth. So actually, the shame creates a cycle where we feel so bad about ourselves that when someone abuses us, we think we deserve it on some level. And that's where abuse can actually take us to that place of very low self-worth. The perpetrator can then use this sense of shame and low self-worth to manipulate the victim and keep her in the relationship. So it's really important to know that the perpetrator wants you to feel shame. They want you to, because that means they can manipulate you more. The abuse has an impact on the victim, such as depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal feelings, eating disorders, etc. And that decreases her sense of self-respect, and then her shame increases because of all these symptoms she has. And this makes it harder to leave the relationship. As the abuse continues, the shame increases, and the victim's sense of self and self-worth is eroded. And now this is the time when women can self-medicate with food, drugs, or alcohol. And I wanted to put a little bit about this in here. I work with many women who talk about comfort eating, particularly. And then they feel really ashamed about that. They feel really ashamed about their relationship with food. They might feel ashamed about their weight. They might feel ashamed about gaining weight. And that can take women to a place of shame. What I want to say is, remember that this is about sadness, not badness. You're not bad because you're doing that. It means you're suffering. It means you need help. But often women are so isolated and shamed that there is no help for them. They're trapped and they don't get support, so they're forced to self-medicate. So if you are If you find yourself self-medicating, and that could be with alcohol, food, drugs, being a workaholic, losing yourself to shopping or the internet, please don't beat yourself up. Please see this as a symptom of your trauma and what you've gone through. And this is a way of you self-medicating and comforting yourself. The problem is that if you then become have addictive behavior, that can also increase the shame you feel as well. So this is a little picture which just shows the cycle of shame and addiction. So in the top right corner, you have the stress. That might be the stress, the anxiety, the fear, the terror you're feeling because of the domestic abuse. You need comfort. There is no comfort because you're isolated. Maybe you're not allowed to ask for help, or you feel you don't deserve help. So you can only self-comfort. So what will you do? You might turn to food, and you might self-comfort through eating, or it could be something else. This might give you a temporary relief, where it might numb you out, or just give you a break from the feelings of stress. You might feel temporarily better or get a sugar high. And then after that, it's very normal to feel huge feelings of guilt. You might feel self-disgust, you've eaten so much. You might feel shame about that. You might feel shame about having a hangover. You might feel terrible about that. And then because of that guilt, you're more likely then to feel more anxiety, more stress. When the perpetrator abuses you, you feel bad about yourself. So you feel like you deserve it more. And then your stress increases. And then you're going to need comfort at some point. And then you might turn to food again. And you can see how you get caught in this cycle of abuse going round and round and round and round. The key thing is, if you want to break this cycle of shame and this cycle of dependency, is at the point when it says need comfort, you recognize you need comfort, and try and think of other ways you can comfort yourself. Now it's a really easy thing for me to say, but we're going to be looking a little bit about this, about what we can do, how we can get support, how we can get comfort to help us. So moving on, let's think about how we can comfort ourselves and try and break the cycle of shame. So shame is pervasive and profound, but with love, loving attention and courage, I believe healing is possible. And here's some thoughts that I'll leave you with when you think about healing your shame. So first of all, let yourself learn through and through that your shame is not your fault. If we run and hide from it, it's not going to go away. So there's something to be said for facing shame, experiencing it, feeling it, and incorporating it. As you are your memories and your history, your joys and your talents, you are also currently your experiences of shame. So what you can learn is not to deny your experiences, but to face them and incorporate them into yourself. Please don't feel ashamed about your shame. There's nothing shameful about it. You've earned your shame by surviving in the midst of shaming people. But you can also really take time to understand it. And through understanding it, you might realize that your shame is not yours, that it belongs to the shaming people who have shamed you. And you might replace it with self-compassion. So in terms of self-comfort, you might think about making connections with people who don't shame you. You can learn from your experience that you're not unworthy of belonging to the human community. And in order to heal your shame, you can create another healthy family or tribe for yourself. Now, I know this is long-term work, but there's something I want to talk about here, which is the paradox of abuse, is that you are completely controlled and violated, but it's also a very, very lonely experience. You're often very isolated and very alone, and you feel like you're going mad in a mad world. And because of the trauma of abuse, and because the abuse is by someone you loved and trusted, you often lose your faith and trust in humanity. However, it's very hard to heal from shame alone. The paradox of healing from shame is the thing that caused you pain, which is a human relationship, but also the very things that can heal you. When you're in a group, whether it's a webinar or a workshop, you realize you're not alone. You realize that abuse can happen to anyone. You realize it's not your fault. Hopefully also you realize that not all human beings are shaming people, and that there are decent human beings out there. And you can start restoring your faith in human nature and start restoring your faith in yourself and realizing it's not you and there's nothing wrong with you. So self-understanding and self-compassion are the key to healing and releasing shame, which we've talked about. It is important to try and replace internal criticism and judgment with self-understanding and nurturing. Self-care means treating yourself with respect and kindness. This is the opposite to the abuse you have experienced. So think about showing yourself these qualities just as you would to a friend who'd been abused. So what I want to say is, although it's important to try and be around people who don't shame you, it's also really, really important to think about how you are with yourself. Are you shaming yourself with your self-talk and the way you are with yourself? If you are, try and bring these qualities to your relationship to yourself. So patience, gentleness, respect, nurturing attention, non-judgment, warmth, kindness, empathy, and understanding. Now, I know as I'm reading out that list, you're probably just maybe switching off, but I'd really encourage you to think about those words, because what I see in my work is that women I work with will show those qualities to other people straight away. If they see anyone else suffering, they'll be incredibly kind to them, incredibly non-judgmental, respectful and gentle, really understanding and patient. But when it comes to themselves, they'll really beat themselves up. So I really want you to think about your relationship with yourself and how you are with yourself. Are you beating yourself up, which keeps you in a place of self-shaming? Or are you going to break the cycle of shame by being kind to yourself? Also, it's not just how you are on the inside, it's also about how you are with your body on the outside. So self-care can also be about taking the time to try and have 3 healthy meals a day, bringing a sort of healthy routine back to your life, going for a walk in nature. I know it's been so hard recently with lockdown to get out and be with people in a healthy way. But as things open up and the blossom is coming out, maybe I think about going for a walk in nature, connecting to nature, practicing sleep hygiene. So many women with trauma don't sleep properly. So you're exhausted. That can make you late and irritable and isolated. So it can be worth thinking about, getting in the habit of a good sleeping routine, turning off your computers an hour before bed, not looking at your phone before bed, if that keeps you awake, having some chamomile tea, something like that. Listening to a soothing podcast can be useful, trying to listen to other kind voices, I think could be a really helpful thing. Spending time with safe people, as we said in the last slide, if we're to heal from shame, part of that is realizing that we are entitled to be part of the human race. We are allowed to be around people. We are allowed to be loved. But safe people, people you can be yourself with, people you can make boundaries with. If you feel you don't have any safe people in your life right now, and maybe you don't because you've been so isolated, please have compassion for yourself and maybe think about how you can be with people in a safe way. So that might be coming to support groups or webinars. It might be joining some sort of evening class where it's very boundaried and you don't have to talk about yourself. It might be doing some voluntary work. So that's something to think about. Also, when you're by yourself, which so many people are very isolated because of lockdown, think about what you expose yourself to. Social media can also be really shaming. If we're seeing loads of people supposedly having a wonderful time, looking beautiful and popular and gorgeous on holiday, and you're feeling crap and rubbish, and you've binged on chocolate and you're on your own, it's going to make you feel really bad looking at that stuff. We know it's all not true as well. It's just a sort of fantasy, a lot of social media, but it can make you feel really bad. So think about what you look at, think about what you expose yourself to. If you watch a horror film and it triggers you, you don't have to watch it. You can choose to comfort yourself with gentleness and kindness. Okay, so last of all, you can see down the left, it spells out shame, and this is, I think, a nice way to try and think about transforming shame into something positive for us. So the S could be for self-compassion. You have suffered enough. Be gentle with yourself. Try to develop a kind inner voice rather than an inner critic that judges you. Remember, if you feel sad, you feel sad. It doesn't make you a bad person. So sad, not bad. Human connection. Break the secrecy, silence, and isolation of shame. You deserve to be part of the human race. Surround yourself with kind, nurturing people. The A for acceptance, acceptance of self. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to be flawed. It's okay to be different. It's okay to change your mind. It's okay to have a bad day. No one can be perfect. It's also okay to accept compliments as well. Me time. I know a lot of women really struggle with this, but try making time to work on your relationship with yourself, looking after yourself, eating healthily, sleeping, getting good exercise that helps you sleep at night, making boundaries to protect yourself and your time. Really, really important. Learning to say no without feeling guilty. That's one of the hardest things, I think, for women who've gone through domestic abuse. So you can practice saying no to people and not feeling guilty about it. You're allowed to prioritize yourself. It doesn't make you selfish. It doesn't make you cruel. It just means you're showing yourself the same respect that you show other people. Lastly, express yourself. Shame is a prison. It stops us being ourselves. It stops us expressing ourselves, and it keeps us silent. So self-expression means breaking the shackles of shame. Express yourself in a way that feels comfortable to you. That could be writing poems. It could be singing, listening, dancing on your own or with others. It could be just sitting down and having a really good cry. Maybe that's a form of self-expression. It could be need to go and smash some plates in the garden, get your anger out. That could be another form of it. Watching something funny maybe that makes you laugh. It could be you redecorate your house. It could be that you want to think about your creativity. There's many, many ways you can express yourself. Last of all, I wanted to show you this slide. Some of you might have seen this image on social media because it's quite often posted. This image came to my attention many years ago. I worked with a client who said she felt like damaged goods and she felt broken and damaged. And then she came across this and it really helped her. So I said, this is a Japanese art form called kintsukuroi, and it means to repair with gold. So when you have a broken bowl or a broken vase or something, it's the art of repairing pottery with gold or silver lacquer and understanding that the piece is more beautiful for having been broken. I think that's really beautiful when we think about healing from shame. You might feel like damaged goods, but you're not damaged goods. Trauma can break us down, but if we can repair ourselves with gold, and for me, the gold would mean self-love and self-compassion and kindness rather than shaming ourselves, I believe we can be more beautiful if I hadn't been broken. And this is about integrating our experiences. And that's about traumatic growth. We're accepting, yes, you've been through trauma and yes, it's had an impact on you, but healing is possible. And you have nothing to feel ashamed of because of your experiences. In fact, you can be more beautiful and more proud of yourself. So I think that's a really beautiful image to end on. Last of all, just a little bit about getting support. When we've been abused, we can lose our trust and faith in human nature, and it can be tempting to self-isolate as this feels safer. However, this can make life lonely and empty. So it's important we find ways of getting support and connection when we are ready to do so. So we talked about finding safe ways to get support, and the workshops and support groups we run at Women's Trust can be a safe way of meeting other people who had similar experiences in a confidential setting. Some women find voluntary work a good way to be with others in a safe way, and that can also increase our self-esteem. And then as the world opens up again, hopefully after COVID, there might be yoga classes, you might go to the gym, art classes. This can be a safe way to meet people in an environment where you have something to do and you don't have to open up to people if you don't want to. Lastly, here are some different places that might offer support. If you have a lot of shame and you watch this and it's made you feel really awful and suicidal, Samaritans have a 24-hour helpline, 116123, which is really, it can be really helpful just to talk to a human being. There's also the National Domestic Violence Helpline, who can signpost you to services in your area. And here we have some different places: Rape Crisis, NIA, Solace, Women and Girls Network, the Havens and the Samaritans websites. All have lots and lots of information and resources on those websites. And last of all, for those of you who want some legal advice, if you're going through domestic abuse, the Rights of Women website has a lot of resources for legal advice. So that's just some information there. So we're going to end this webinar now. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.